Hey friends, welcome back to another video. My name's Lefebvre, and an important part of developing your art style is trying different things and trying different techniques and different styles to see what sticks and maybe what doesn't. So today I'm going to try and paint some looser hydrangeas with a different technique that I don't really do very often. So let's take a look and see if it actually works out. Okay friends, so today I am trying a different technique when it comes to painting watercolor florals, specifically hydrangeas. Now, I do a lot of different kind of styles when it comes to my loose florals, but this one I wanted to try where I would do the wet on wet technique to start to put down a base of my hydrangea bush and then go back in with some more abstract lines to create shadows and depth within my painting. So as you saw, I'm using a mop brush just because it has tons of water. It holds a lot of water. Bristles are very nice and soft. I tried to wet the whole page, and now I'm just going in with some quinacridone magenta, I think it is, or quinacridone rose, to create those loose hydrangea balls, floral, just shapes. Now you can see kind of the edges of those. You see how they're kind of blended out a little bit more? You can manipulate it to fix that, which is what I'm doing here. Wash and dry off your brush. So make sure there's not a ton of water, because if you drop water on it, it's gonna create blooms. Wash and dry off your brush and then manipulate those edges so you don't get that kind of flared out kind of look to the edges. Just a little tip. And then I added some blue towards the sky, and now I'm dropping in some green for where the leaves and the greenery are gonna go. So, like I said, I don't do this type of painting very often, but I love the way it looks and it's something I want to get better at. So I figured I'd give it a try with you guys on camera. So starting with the wet on wet, trying to keep it loose, trying to keep the shapes loose. Also here adding in some darker green on top of my olive green to get some shadows within that. And just playing around with different ways and different shapes. So the other thing I wanted to do here was add in some of that shadow while it's still wet, so you get those softer bleeds and blends. So I add a little bit more of the quinacridone rose to the shadowy parts, the bottom right side of the hydrangeas. Then I mixed the quinacridone rose with a little bit of a dark green to get more of a shadowy color. And I just try and keep the page as wet as I can. So with this kind of technique, you are going to have to move fast so it doesn't dry. Once it starts drying, then that's when you can get those harsh lines and those blooms. So you got to move quickly, which is another piece of this to kind of figure out how you're going to do that. All right, so then I'm just taking my brush, which I washed off, and I dried on my paper towel, and I'm trying to lift some highlights while it's still wet. So I switched to my filbert brush here to get some more petal, like natural petal shapes with my brush. And like I said, I washed and I dried it off, and you just use a lot of pressure and you try and lift some of that pigment off to help get the highlights. Now you can see in some areas it's not lifting as well because it has started to dry. So again, this is another thing you have to work quickly on. This whole style, I feel like you have to work very quickly to get some of those techniques down, which in itself is something to practice. So I'm just trying to lift, and the parts that I'm lifting are the top left corners. That's where the highlights are going to be. The shadows are the bottom right. And then here I'm actually grabbing some of that dark shadowy pink color to add in some of the shadows while it's still wet. Now, where I start to go not wrong with this, but where I was getting a little bit impatient. And one thing I learned is that when I start trying to add in the shadows, I didn't let it completely dry. So you'll start to see some kind of fuzzy edged shadows in there, which I feel like would have looked a lot better if I let it completely dry. So here I am just taking the mop brush again, and I'm trying to add those shadows in, and they're not bad. The thing is though, my paper is starting to dry, so the edges aren't as blended and as fuzzy as it would be if I worked completely wet on wet. There's this kind of spot between a wet page and a dry page where it's like damp, which if you saw right where I just placed that watercolor, you'll start to get some of those blooms, okay? It's when your page is damp, it's not completely wet, not completely dry. The pigment and the water that you are placing onto your paper is slightly more wet than what's on the page, and it's gonna give you some of those blooms. So see the bottom right? I wish I could just point it to it. There's a bit more of a bloom, and these lines are starting to look a little bit more fuzzy and harder edged, and I don't necessarily like that. What I should have done here was probably waited until it was completely dry to place in those shadows. Is this ruined? Not at all. I am learning of how I want to do this, and what you can do to kind of fix this if you need to is wash off your brush, completely dry it, and then kind of soften out those edges. But here I just kept going with it. I waited for it to completely dry a bit more. Now I'm going back in with my filbert and I'm creating some of those hydrangea petals to mask some of those those blends and the lines that are a little bit more harsh. So there are ways you can just keep going and figuring it out, which is something I suggest if you're trying anything that's new that you're not completely familiar with. Don't crumple it up and walk away. See if you can fix it. Keep going, because you might learn something super valuable of how to make it better just by going with it. So I'm adding in mid-tones of some of these petals, and then after that I'm going to go back in with some darker pink and add even more shadows. Before I do that, here I'm starting to kind of crisp up some of those leaves. Again, I don't want to draw really detailed leaves. I'm just trying to add the shadows, still making it loose, giving it the same vibe as the flowers where it's not super detailed, but I want to add in some dark green to really gain some depth within these hydrangeas. So I place that dark green right around the edge, which also helps the hydrangeas pop out more. And it's almost kind of like negative painting. So you're not painting the petals, you're painting around the petals to get the shape of the hydrangea. So I'm adding in that dark green, and then I wash and dry off my brush and I blend out the edges so you get a softer edge. It's not just like this hard line. So if you're wondering how I do that, wash and dry off your brush, and then I grab in and blend out those lines. And now is where I'm adding the darker shadow with the pink. Again, just creating that dark pink color by using my quinacridone rose and some dark green. And then here where I'm placing the shadows, I'm trying to, again, go for that negative painting kind of look. What you want to do here is you don't want to paint the actual petals, you want to paint around the petals. So the little kind of creases in between or underneath the petals where there would be shadows, that's what you're trying to paint. Does this look perfect? Not at all. Am I doing it completely correct? Not at all. But I'm trying to kind of carve out some of those petal shapes by painting around them. So that's going to hopefully give it some depth. I found it started to look a little bit wonky. Definitely something I need to kind of work on, but I just kept going to see if I could get it to look the way I wanted to. I added a little bit of dots in there for some of the centers of the hydrangeas, and then I started to do this more like kind of sketchy outline. I want to make it look a little bit more sketchy looking than detailed. Okay, and then finally with this piece, I decided that I didn't like that kind of top right corner of the hydrangea. I felt like it looked a little off. So to mask that, I just took some dark green and painted over the pink. You know, a lot of people think that watercolor is not very forgiving, but it definitely can be, and you can paint over things and mask areas that you don't like. So here I'm just trying to do that negative painting, paint around it, and fix it accordingly. And honestly, I kind of like the way that this painting turned out. I feel like I learned a lot and can continue to develop my skills with this type of style. Thank you all so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and follow me on all my other platforms for tons more content. Have a wonderful day, guys. Bye.